First Story by John Hartley. I'm John Hartley, and I've been a police officer for just over a year. I want to share an experience from one of my first night shifts that still haunts me to this day. It was in the small town of Oakwood, Virginia, a place where everyone knows everyone, and the crime rate is practically non-existent. That night, my partner, Officer Daniels, called in sick, so I was assigned to patrol alone. It was around 2 a.m., and the town was enveloped in a thick fog, the kind that turns familiar streets into a ghostly labyrinth. My patrol started off uneventful, just the usual check of local businesses and the occasional drive through residential areas. But as the night progressed, things started to get strange. First, it was the radio. It began picking up static, and then amidst the crackling, I heard what sounded like a whisper. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sent a chill down my spine. I checked the radio, thinking it was a transmission issue, but it was working perfectly. Then came the call. Dispatch informed me of a reported disturbance at the old Henderson place, a house long rumored to be haunted. As a man of science, I never believed in such tales, but that night, I couldn't shake off a feeling of dread. When I arrived, the house loomed ominously in the fog. I approached cautiously, flashlight in hand. The front door was ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Inside, the air was stale, and the silence was suffocating. I called out, announcing my presence, but there was no response. As I ventured deeper, the floorboards groaned under my weight, and the shadows seemed to dance in the corners of my eyes. Suddenly, I heard footsteps upstairs. I drew my weapon, heart pounding in my chest, and made my way to the second floor. The hallway was lined with old family portraits, their eyes seeming to follow me. I reached the room where the footsteps had come from, but it was empty. Then, behind me, a door slammed shut. I spun around, adrenaline surging through my veins. But there was nothing there. Just an empty hallway and the echo of my own breathing. I checked every room, but the house was deserted. As I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The rest of the night was a blur of paranoia. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking figure, and every noise was a potential threat. When I finally returned to the station, the sun was rising, casting its light on a world that suddenly seemed much less familiar. I never spoke of that night to anyone, fearing they'd think I'd lost my mind. But I know what I experienced, and it changed me. There's a thin veil between the known and the unknown, and that night, I peeked behind it. That's my story. A night shift that started like any other, but ended in a way that still haunts my dreams. The truth is, sometimes the scariest things are those we can't explain. That was a bone-chilling tale from John Hartley, but brace yourself because the next story by Emily Carter takes us into the eerie halls of a hospital during a night shift that is anything but ordinary. Prepare for an experience that will make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Second Story by Emily Carter. My name is Emily Carter, and I'm a nurse. I've worked in many departments, but nothing compares to the night I spent in the old wing of St. Mary's Hospital. This story isn't just about what I saw or heard. It's about how that night felt. A relentless, creeping dread that clung to me long after the shift ended. It was a winter night in 2019 in the quiet town of Ashford, Maine. The old wing was barely used, a remnant of the past with its creaky floors and flickering lights. I was assigned there due to staff shortages, tasked with looking after a handful of patients. The night started off as usual, with the routine checks and medication rounds. The silence of the wing was almost soothing, a stark contrast to the usual bustle of the hospital. But as the night wore on, that silence grew heavier, suffocating. It began with a call bell ringing from a room at the end of the hall. I checked the monitor. It was Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly lady who often got confused at night. I made my way to her room, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. But when I entered her room, she was sound asleep, the call bell untouched on her bedside table. Puzzled, I returned to the nurse's station, attributing it to a glitch in the system. That's when I noticed the temperature drop. It was subtle at first, but soon my breath was visible in the air. I checked the thermostat. It was set to a comfortable 70 degrees Fahrenheit, but it felt like it was below freezing. The next few hours were a blur of strange occurrences. Doors would close on their own. The lights in the corridor flickered incessantly, and several times I heard the sound of footsteps following me, only to turn around and find no one there. But the most unsettling incident happened around 3 a.m. I was in the medication room when I heard a soft humming. It sounded like a lullaby, eerie and out of place. I stepped into the corridor and the humming grew louder, leading me to the end of the hall. There, in the dim light, stood a figure. It was a woman dressed in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, her back to me. I called out to her, thinking she might be a lost staff member, but as I approached, she vanished, leaving me alone in the chilling silence. I was shaken, questioning my own sanity. I've never believed in ghosts or the supernatural, but that night made me question everything. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking figure, every noise a whisper from the past. As dawn broke and the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. I finished my shift in a daze, unable to shake the feeling of unseen eyes watching me. I never worked in the old wing again, and a few months later, it was closed for renovation. I don't know what I saw or heard that night, but it's a memory that still sends shivers down my spine. It was a reminder that some places hold secrets that are best left undisturbed. Emily's harrowing experience in the old hospital wing is enough to make anyone's skin crawl. Up next, we have Mark Sullivan, a night security guard whose story of a lone shift in a deserted warehouse is filled with unnerving events that defy explanation. Get ready for a tale that's sure to keep you looking over your shoulder. Third story by Mark Sullivan. Hello, I'm Mark Sullivan, and for several years I worked as a night security guard at an old warehouse on the outskirts of Denver, Colorado. The warehouse was part of a now defunct manufacturing company and had been mostly empty for years. My job was simple: patrol the premises, ensure against trespassers or vandals, and keep an eye on the CCTV. But one particular night in 2021 changed my perception of the job entirely. The night started like any other. I arrived at the deserted warehouse as the sun set, casting long shadows across the dilapidated structure. The first few hours passed uneventfully, with only the occasional sound of the building settling to break the silence. It was around midnight when things began to feel off. As I sat in the security office, I heard what sounded like footsteps above me. Now this was odd, because the upper floors were off limits due to safety concerns. Thinking it might be a vagrant, I decided to investigate. As I ascended the creaky stairs, the temperature dropped noticeably. It was midsummer, so the chill was unexpected and unsettling. Reaching the top floor, I found it empty, the only sound the echo of my own footsteps. But then, as I turned to leave, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of someone walking, but this time on the floor below me. Rushing downstairs, I found myself in a game of cat and mouse, always one step behind these elusive footsteps. It was during this chase that I noticed something on the CCTV monitor. A door on the ground floor, which I had checked and secured earlier, was now wide open. I made my way to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The door led to an old storage area filled with shadows and dust. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. Panic set in as I struggled with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then the lights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, and when the beam cut through the darkness, I saw it. Standing at the far end of the room was a figure, shrouded in darkness. I called out, demanding to know who was there, but there was no response, just the sound of my own ragged breathing. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in fear, but eventually the lights flickered back on. The figure was gone, and the door opened easily. I checked the entire building, but found no sign of any intruder. I finished my shift that night, but I never returned to the warehouse. Whatever I saw, it wasn't human, and it wasn't something I ever wanted to encounter again. The warehouse was demolished later that year, and I can't help but feel relieved that whatever was in there is gone now. Mark Sullivan's chilling encounter in the old warehouse is the stuff of nightmares. But our next story, written by Sarah Johnson, takes us to a remote gas station where a night shift turns into a dangerous game of survival against a series of increasingly bizarre and threatening encounters. Get ready for a story that blurs the line between reality and paranoia. Fourth story by Sarah Johnson. My name is Sarah Johnson, and I used to work the night shift at a gas station off a lonely stretch of highway near Albuquerque, New Mexico. This job was typically uneventful, a welcome boredom for a college student. But one night in late 2022, my shift became a sequence of events so strange and terrifying that I quit the next day. The gas station was a beacon of light in the vast darkness of the desert night. That evening, a storm was brewing, the kind that churns the sky and makes the air crackle with electricity. It set the stage for what was to come. The first odd occurrence was a power flicker around 11 p.m. The lights dimmed, the radio crackled, and the computers rebooted. It was brief, but it left me feeling uneasy. The wind howled outside, and the rain began to lash against the windows. Around midnight, the first customer of the night arrived. He was an ordinary-looking man, but his behavior was anything but. He wandered the aisles for nearly an hour, picking up items and then putting them back in the wrong places, all the while muttering to himself. When he finally came to the counter, he stared at me for a long moment before leaving without buying anything. His intense gaze sent shivers down my spine. An hour later, a group of teenagers came in, loud and boisterous. They bought snacks and joked around, but there was something off about their laughter, something hollow. As they left, one of them stopped and turned to me, his expression suddenly serious. "Be careful," he said, and they were gone, leaving me puzzled and unnerved. The night grew wilder, the storm raging outside. Several times I saw shadows flit past the windows, too quick to be just the wind-blown debris. Then the phone rang. When I answered, there was only static at first, then a whispering voice that said, "Watch the pumps." I looked out, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing by the gas pumps, but when I blinked, it was gone. The climax of the night was near 3 a.m. The power went out completely, plunging the gas station into darkness. The backup generator failed to kick in, and I was left in the pitch black, the storm's fury the only sound. I fumbled for my phone, using it as a makeshift flashlight. As I made my way to the breaker box, I heard it. The sound of the front door opening, then footsteps. I called out, but there was no answer. The footsteps grew closer, and I hid behind the counter, heart racing. I waited, expecting the worst, but the footsteps receded, and the door closed again. When the power returned, the sun was rising, casting a pale light on a world that seemed normal again. I checked the store. Nothing was out of place, and there was no sign of any intruder. I never found out who or what visited the gas station that night, and part of me is glad I didn't. It was a night of unexplained occurrences and unseen visitors, a night that convinced me some things are better left unknown. Sarah's harrowing experience at the gas station is a stark reminder of the unexpected dangers that can lurk in the most mundane places. Our final story comes from Alex Thompson, a librarian who found himself facing an inexplicable and terrifying ordeal during a solo night shift in a small town library. Prepare for a tale that intertwines the ordinary with the supernatural. Fifth story by Alex Thompson. My name is Alex Thompson, and I'm a librarian in a small, picturesque town in Vermont. I've always found comfort in the quiet, orderly world of books. That is, until one winter night in 2023, during a solo shift at our town library, when my perception of reality was turned upside down. The library, a historic building with creaky floors and towering shelves, was usually a place of refuge for me. That night, a heavy snowstorm had hit the town, and I was alone, tasked with cataloging a recent donation of old books. At first, the solitude was peaceful, the only sounds being the howling wind outside and the occasional creak of the building settling. As the night progressed, however, the atmosphere began to shift. It started with a feeling of being watched. I brushed it off as nerves, the product of an overactive imagination fueled by the storm. But then, books began to fall from the shelves. Not in heaps, but one by one, as if someone were pulling them out and letting them drop. Each thud made my heart jump, and I meticulously replaced each book, trying to shake off the growing unease. As I worked, I heard a faint noise, like a whisper. Thinking someone might have been caught in the storm and sought shelter, I called out, but there was no response. The whispering continued, a soft, indecipherable murmur that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. Around midnight, the lights flickered and went out, leaving me in near total darkness. The emergency lights cast an eerie glow, creating more shadows than they dispelled. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way to the fuse box in the basement. Descending the stairs, the whispering grew louder, and I could now make out a word being repeated. Leave! My skin crawled, and every instinct screamed at me to heed the warning. But I pressed on, determined to find a logical explanation. In the basement, amidst the rows of archived newspapers and old records, I felt a cold breeze. There, in the far corner, was an open window. I approached it, puzzled, as I was certain it had been locked. As I reached out to close it, a gust of wind blew through, scattering papers everywhere. And that's when I saw it. A shadowy figure standing just outside the window, its features obscured by the darkness. I stumbled back, tripping over a stack of books. When I looked up again, the figure was gone, and the window was closed as if it had never been open. I hurried back upstairs, my mind racing with fear and confusion. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed in the well-lit main area, jumping at every sound, counting the minutes until dawn. When morning came, I was relieved to see the familiar faces of my colleagues. I never told them what happened, fearing they wouldn't believe me. I still work at the library, but I refuse to stay late. I don't know what I saw or experienced that night, but it's a memory that lingers, a reminder that there are mysteries in this world that are best left unsolved. That concludes our collection of eerie night shift stories. Each tale, a unique journey into the unknown, reminds us that sometimes the most ordinary places can hold the most extraordinary secrets. If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to check out the recommended video on your screen now. It's one of my personal favorites. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay safe and keep an eye out for the mysteries that lurk in the shadows.